Sand grated between Rachel's back molars long before the first mortar shell fractured the morning air. 500 hostile fighters were already swarming the outer wire, pouring over the reinforced barriers like dirty water through a broken dam. She wasn't supposed to be the last line of defense. She was just a fatigued operator with a malfunctioning radio, a blistering sunburn, and a rifle. What happens when a single, cornered sniper sits stranded in a steel tower above a massacre? Hell drops in. Sweat pooled in the hollow of Rachel's collarbone, hot and irritating. It ran in a jagged line down her spine, soaking into the rigid fabric of her combat shirt. She shifted her weight on the metal grating of Tower 4, ignoring the sharp squeal of the rusted hinges beneath her. Below, forward operating base. Oulette smelled like a mixture of raw sewage, diesel fumes, and the sweet, nauseating rot of the burn pit. It was a Tuesday. Rachel pressed the heel of her hand against her right eye, trying to rub away the dull, throbbing headache situated just behind her brow. 3 hours of sleep in a cot that smelled of mildew and another operator's foot powder wasn't cutting it. She reached for her canteen, unscrewing the plastic cap with thick, calloused fingers. The water inside was the temperature of hot tea. She drank it anyway, grimacing as it washed the taste of stale instant coffee down her throat. "You're breathing too loud," Cobb muttered. Cobb lay 3 feet away, his eye pressed to the spotting scope. He was a lanky kid from Idaho who chewed his fingernails down to the quick and always smelled faintly of stale chewing tobacco. He was a good spotter. He was just irritatingly observant. "You're smelling too loud," Rachel snapped back, though there was no real venom in it. She wiped her mouth with the back of a grit-covered glove. She picked up her Mark 13 sniper rifle. The composite stock felt familiar, a heavy, dead weight that somehow anchored her to the spinning earth. She settled behind the glass, the rubber cup of the scope pressing against her orbital bone. The world narrowed into a crisp, magnified circle of beige dust, jagged rocks, and sparse, withered scrub brush. Out there, past the razor wire and the Hesco bastions, the valley stretched out like a dry, cracked tongue. It was dead quiet. The kind of quiet that made the tiny hairs on the back of Rachel's neck stand up. The cicadas had stopped screaming. Even the wind, which usually howled through the canyon, had died down to a breathless, suffocating crawl. "See anything?" she asked, her voice dropping an octave, slipping into the cold, flat rhythm of the job. "Nothing," Cobb whispered. He spit a dark stream of tobacco juice into an empty Gatorade bottle. The plastic gave a hollow plink. "Heat distortion is getting bad near the ridgeline. Mirage is dancing like crazy." Rachel adjusted her magnification. He was right. The horizon was a watery blur, shifting and waving in the oppressive heat. She blinked, feeling a sudden, sharp sting of sweat rolling into her eye. She kept it open, fighting the reflex to wipe it. Then she felt it. It wasn't a sound, not at first. It was a vibration, a low, rhythmic thrumming that travelled through the bedrock, up the steel supports of the Watchtower, and straight into the soles of her boots. Cobb froze. The Gatorade bottle slipped from his hand, rolling across the grated floor. "Seismic?" Rachel asked, her pulse suddenly kicking up a notch. "No," Cobb said, his voice tighter now, stripped of its lazy drawl. "Engines, a lot of them." Rachel swept her scope across the eastern ridge. The mirage wavered, parted by a sudden, massive bloom of brown dust. It wasn't just a convoy. The dust cloud stretched for a mile across the horizon, a rolling, choking wave of pulverized earth obscuring a dark, metallic tide underneath. "Gutierrez," Rachel said, tapping the comms unit on her chest. "Tower 4 to TOC. We have movement. Grid. Shit, Cobb, give me a grid. Alpha 903, Cobb stammered, his eye glued to the glass. Jesus, Cole, look at the drawer. Rachel shifted the rifle. Through the magnification, the dust parted slightly. She didn't see 10 trucks. She saw 40, technicals, armored bulldozers, and pouring out from behind them, a sprawling mass of bodies on foot, carrying AKs, RPGs, and heavy machine guns. They weren't sneaking. They weren't using cover. They were walking upright, a sheer wall of flesh and steel, moving with terrifying mathematical purpose. TOC, this is Tower 4, Rachel barked into the radio, her voice cracking slightly. She cleared her throat. We have a massive hostile element approaching from the east. Estimated strength, God, hundreds, 500 plus. Static hissed back. A sharp, rhythmic popping sound, like bacon grease hitting a hot pan. TOC, acknowledge. More static. Comms are jammed, Cobb said, his face draining of colour. He looked up at her, a young man suddenly realizing his own mortality. They're rolling over the repeaters. Rachel looked down at her hands. They were trembling, a fine, high-frequency shake. She wasn't a superhero. She was 32 years old, her knees ached, she had a mortgage back in Coronado, and her stomach suddenly cramped with terrifying, violent nausea. She swallowed hard, tasting bile. Get on the secondary dial, she ordered, forcing the tremor out of her voice. She pulled the bolt back on the Mark 13, the cold click-clack of machined steel cutting through the suffocating heat. We aren't waiting for permission. The first mortar didn't whistle. It simply arrived. A deafening, earth-shattering crack tore the air apart just 50 yards from the base of their tower. The shockwave punched Rachel in the chest, stealing her breath and violently rattling her teeth. A geyser of dirt, shredded sandbags, and black smoke erupted into the sky. Rocks rained down on the corrugated metal roof of the Watchtower, clattering like a handful of dropped coins. Before the dust from the first impact even began to settle, the chorus started. Thump, thump, thump. A dozen heavy machine guns opened up simultaneously from the ridgeline. Green tracers sliced through the dusty air, a chaotic web of light crisscrossing over the FOB. They're hitting the main gate, Cobb screamed over the deafening roar. Rachel didn't look at the gate. She didn't look at the chaos erupting in the courtyard below, where Marines were sprinting from their hooches, half-dressed, dragging ammo cans. She kept her eye pressed to the scope. The world was narrowed down to her retinas. An armoured bulldozer, painted a flat, rusted brown, was barreling straight toward the northern wire. Behind it, a swarm of fighters used the massive blade as rolling cover. Distance to the dozer, Rachel said, her voice eerily calm, despite the erratic, terrified hammering of her heart. 600 yards, Cobb said, fumbling with his laser rangefinder. Wind is full value, left to right, maybe 5 miles per hour. Rachel dialed the elevation turret. Click, click, click. She adjusted her hold for the wind. The crosshairs settled on the thick, dirty glass of the bulldozer's cab. She inhaled, the smell of cordite and burning diesel flooding her lungs. She let half the breath out. The crosshairs hovered over the dark silhouette driving the machine. She pressed the trigger. The Mark 13 barked, slamming into her shoulder with the familiar, bruising recoil. A heavy .300 Win Mag round punched through the air. A second later, the safety glass of the bulldozer shattered into a white, spider-webbed pattern. The driver slumped over the controls. "Hit!" Cobb yelled, his voice cracking. But the bulldozer didn't stop. The dead man's foot remained heavy on the accelerator. It crashed into the outer perimeter, crushing the concertina wire and ploughing straight into the HESCO barriers. The wire mesh snapped, dumping tons of sand into the trench. A ramp was instantly created. "It breached," Rachel said numbly, racking the bolt. A smoking brass casing flipped out, bouncing off the metal floor and burning a hot red welt into her exposed forearm. She didn't flinch. Through the dust, the tide poured in. Hostile fighters swarmed up the collapsed sand barrier, screaming, firing from the hip. Below, the base's automated defenses and the desperate return fire of the garrison cut into the first wave. Men fell in grisly, broken heaps, bodies tangled in the remaining razor wire. But for everyone that went down, 3 more stepped over him. An RPG streaked out of the dust cloud, a blinding streak of white flame. "Incoming!" Cobb shrieked. Rachel dropped, pressing her face against the hot, filthy grating. The warhead struck the wall of the TOC building beneath them. The explosion was a physical blow, a concussive slap that popped her ears and rattled her brain against her skull. Ash and burning insulation drifted up into the tower. She pushed herself up, coughing, her eyes streaming tears. "Cobb, you good?" Cobb was on his knees, staring at his left arm. The sleeve of his combat shirt was shredded. A piece of jagged shrapnel the size of a razor blade was embedded deep in his bicep. Blood, dark and thick, was pulsing rapidly, soaking the fabric and pooling on the floor grates. "I'm hit," he said, his voice small, sounding like a child. "Rachel, I'm hit bad." "Let me see." She crawled over to him, her hands slipping on the slick metal. She grabbed his arm, applying immediate pressure. He let out a sharp, agonizing wail. "Shut up. Keep your head down," she hissed, ripping a tourniquet from her vest. She looped it high and tight around his arm, twisting the windlass until he gasped and almost passed out. She velcroed it down. The bleeding slowed to a sluggish weep. I can't glass for you," Cobb breathed, his skin now the color of old ash. "You don't need to," Rachel said, grabbing his harness and dragging him into the most protected corner of the tower, behind a solid steel plate. "Just stay here. Keep pressure on it." She crawled back to her rifle. The bipod legs scraped against the metal. She looked through the scope again. The perimeter was entirely gone. The courtyard was a nightmare of dust, blood, and point-blank violence. The enemy was inside the wire. They were throwing grenades into the sleeping quarters. They were firing blindly into the mess hall. Rachel was alone in a box in the sky, 4 stories above the slaughter. She felt a profound, horrifying detachment. Her stomach churned again, but she forced the bile back down. She wiped the sweat from her eye. The math in her head was simple. 500 minus 1 was 499. She chambered a new round. Without a spotter, the math of death became a deeply isolating process. Rachel's mind compartmentalized the terror, shoving the shrieks and explosions into a muffled box in the back of her brain. Her world shrunk entirely to the reticle. She needed targets of opportunity, high-value threats. Through the optics, the chaos of the courtyard resolved into brutal, micro-level tragedies. She saw a Marine, helmet missing, pinned behind a concrete jersey barrier as 3 fighters flanked him. Rachel settled the crosshairs on the chest of the lead fighter. He was wearing a filthy green track jacket, screaming something over the din, an AK-47 raised to his shoulder. Distance, 200 yards. No wind. She exhaled, squeezed. The rifle roared. The fighter's chest exploded in a pink mist, the heavy round lifting him off his feet and slamming him backward into the dust. He didn't twitch. The other 2 fighters froze, looking wildly around for the source of the shot. Rachel worked the bolt. The brass casing pinged off the wall. She found the second man's head in the scope. Squeeze. The crack of the rifle was instantly swallowed by the broader roar of the battle, but the result was immediate. The man's head snapped back, his body crumpling like a dropped puppet. The third fighter scrambled for cover. Rachel didn't bother tracking him. She was already scanning for the next threat. She moved with mechanical, brutal efficiency. There was no joy in it, no surge of heroic adrenaline. Her shoulder began to ache, a deep, bruising pain from the repeated recoil. The barrel of the Mark 13 was growing searingly hot, the heat waves rising from the suppressor, distorting the bottom of her scope's view. Crack. An RPG gunner on the ridgeline dropped his tube, clutching his shattered femur. Crack. A man trying to mount a heavy DSHK machine gun on the back of a truck slumped over the barrel. Crack. A fighter sprinting toward the med tent folded in half, dead before he hit the dirt. Rachel's breathing was ragged. Her throat felt coated in sandpaper. The smell of copper blood from Cobb's corner mixed with the acrid stench of burned powder hanging heavy in the confined tower. 21, she whispered. She was counting. She didn't know why. Down below, the enemy command structure started to realize they were being systematically dismantled from above. The chaos began to organize. Fingers pointed toward Tower 4. A heavy, terrifying thudding sound echoed from the east. Rachel swung her rifle. A technical with a twin-barreled ZU-23 anti-aircraft gun mounted in the bed had rolled through the breached gate. The gunner was frantically cranking the elevation wheels, pointing the massive barrels directly at her watchtower. "Shit!" Rachel hissed. She centered the crosshairs on the gunner's face. She pulled the trigger. Click. Empty magazine. Panic, cold and sharp as a scalpel, sliced through her chest. She dropped the empty mag, her hand diving to her chest rig for a fresh one. She fumbled. Her fingers, slick with sweat and Cobb's blood, slipped on the metal. The magazine clattered against the rifle stock before she jammed it violently into the well. She slapped the bolt closed. It was too late. The ZU-23 roared. The sound wasn't a crack. It was a deafening, mechanical ripping noise. Massive 23mm explosive shells slammed into the watchtower. The steel supports groaned. Shrapnel and jagged shards of metal tore through the air. A piece of the corrugated roof sheared off and spun wildly, slicing a deep, bloody gash across Rachel's cheek. She screamed, not out of pain, but out of pure, unadulterated rage and terror. She threw herself flat against the floorboards as the anti-aircraft rounds chewed the tower to pieces around her. Dust and smoke blinded her. "Cole!" Cobb yelled from the corner, coughing violently. "Cole, get out! They're zeroing us!" Rachel touched her cheek. Her glove came away, soaked in warm, sticky blood. She looked at the blood, her breath hitching in her chest. The fear tried to swallow her whole, demanding she curl into a ball and hide behind the steel plate until it was over. But hiding meant dying. She dragged the heavy rifle toward a small, jagged hole the ZU-23 had just ripped through the metal wall. She shoved the barrel through the jagged edges, slicing the back of her hand on a piece of sharp steel. She didn't care. She jammed her eye behind the scope. The glass was cracked, a hairline fracture running straight through the crosshairs. Through the shattered optic, she found the anti-aircraft gun. The gunner was laughing, shouting down to the driver to reload the belts. Rachel stabilized her breathing, inhaling the dust and the metallic scent of her own blood. She leveled the cracked reticle perfectly on the man's throat. 22, she whispered. Smoke, thick and smelling of vaporized grease and burned cordite, hung stubbornly inside the mangled steel box of Tower 4. Rachel's ears rang with a high, piercing whine, a continuous phantom note born from the sheer concussive force of the anti-aircraft shells that had just attempted to dissect her. She pressed her eye back to the fractured scope of the Mark 13. The Zu-23 gunner was a crumpled heap of green fabric and shattered bone, draped unceremoniously over the twin barrels of his weapon. Below him, the driver of the Technical realized his Overwatch was dead. The man threw the truck into reverse, the tires spinning violently in the loose dirt, kicking up a rooster tail of sand and blood. Rachel didn't track the fleeing truck. Let him run. She had immediate threats flooding the perimeter. She pulled the rifle back from the jagged tear in the metal wall, panting. The barrel of the Mark 13 radiated waves of heat that blurred the air just inches from her face. It smelled like roasting steel and carbon. If she kept up this rate of fire, the barrel would warp, permanently shifting her point of impact. The math would change. She hated when the math changed. "Cobb," she rasped, her throat dry and coated in a fine layer of pulverized concrete. No answer. Rachel snapped her head back, her helmet knocking against a bent steel beam. Cobb was slumped against the far corner, his chin resting on his chest rig. The pool of blood beneath him had expanded, seeping through the metal floor grates and dripping down into the darkness of the lower scaffolding. His face was the color of old, wet canvas. She crawled over the scattered brass casings, the metal cylinders biting into the fabric of her knee pads. She grabbed his shoulder, shaking him roughly. "Cobb! Hey! Stay awake, damn it!" His eyelids fluttered, revealing the rolled-back whites of his eyes before they focused lazily on her face. He swallowed hard, his lips cracked and white. "I'm cold, Rach." "You're not cold. It's 110 degrees out here," she lied, though she knew the shivering was the onset of hemorrhagic shock. His body was pulling blood away from his extremities, desperately trying to keep his core organs functioning. "Drink this." She unhooked her canteen and pressed it to his mouth. He gagged on the warm, plastic-tasting water, coughing most of it down his chin. "I'm tapping out," he slurred, a tragic, lazy smile pulling at the corner of his mouth. "Reckon I'm done glassing for the day." "You don't get to tap out," Rachel said. Her voice was flat, devoid of the panic screaming through her nervous system. She pressed her thumb against the tourniquet windlass, checking its tension. It was tight. The bleeding had stopped, but he had already lost too much. "You stay awake and you count my brass. You hear me? Count." Cobb didn't answer. His chin dropped back to his chest. A fresh wave of nausea hit Rachel, sharp and acidic. She wanted to curl up next to him. She wanted to drop the heavy, burning rifle, pull her knees to her chest, and close her eyes until the shouting and the dying stopped. The contradiction tore at her, the intense, overwhelming desire to survive, warring against the bone-deep, seductive urge to just give up and let the inevitable happen. But down in the courtyard, a Marine was screaming. It wasn't a battle cry. It was a rhythmic, agonizing shriek of raw pain. Rachel's jaw tightened until her molars ached. She turned away from Cobb, her bloody hands leaving rust-colored smears on the metal deck as she dragged herself back to her firing position. She checked her ammunition. She had 3 spare magazines left on her chest rig. 15 rounds, plus the 5 in the gun, 20 bullets against a sea of hostiles. She shoved the rifle barrel back through the jagged hole. The crack in her scope caught the glare of the desert sun, refracting a tiny rainbow directly across her line of sight. She adjusted her angle, ignoring the stinging cut on her cheek where the sweat and grit had worked their way into the raw flesh. Down near the wreckage of the mess hall, a squad of insurgents had pinned down what remained of the base's quick reaction force. The Marines were huddled behind a crumbled Hisco barrier, taking heavy, suppressing fire from a DSHK heavy machine gun mounted on a tripod in the center of the courtyard. Distance, 300 yards, elevation down angle. Heat mirage severe. Rachel estimated the drop. She aimed high, holding the cracked crosshairs over the bald head of the DSHK gunner. She breathed in the smoke, the blood, the stench of Cobb's failing body. She let it out. Crack. The heavy recoil bruised her collarbone again. Through the scope, the bald man collapsed forward, his heavy finger convulsing on the butterfly trigger of the machine gun, sending a final, wild burst of incendiary rounds up into the empty sky. Before the echo of her shot died, Rachel racked the bolt. Clack, clack, a hot casing struck her thigh. A second man rushed to take the dead gunner's place, grabbing the spade grips of the heavy weapon. Crack. He dropped, a dark stain spreading across the back of his tan tunic. The insurgents around the machine gun scattered like roaches exposed to the light. They realized the courtyard was a kill box, and the ghost in Tower 4 was systematically closing the lid. Rachel tracked a fighter running toward the shadow of the motor pool. She led him by 1/2 mil, squeezed, and watched his legs buckle beneath him. But she was running dry, and she was making too much noise. Her radio hissed, a sudden burst of static cutting through the jammer's white noise. "Tower 4, this is actual," a broken, distorted voice spat through the earpiece. It was Captain Miller. He sounded out of breath. "We are falling back to the secondary bunker. Perimeter is lost. Repeat, perimeter is lost. Tower 4, you need to displace. Acknowledge." Rachel keyed her mic, her hands slick with sweat. "Actual, this is 4. I have a wounded spotter. He's non-ambulatory. I can't move him down the ladders. Static. A pop. 4, leave him. That's an order. They are massing at the base of your..." The radio died entirely. Rachel stared at the black plastic box on her chest. Leave him. The cold, tactical logic of the order made perfect sense. A sniper trapped in a fixed position was a dead sniper. A sniper tethered to a bleeding man was 2 dead bodies. She looked back at Cobb. He was completely unconscious now, his breathing shallow and rattling in his throat. "Displace," she whispered to herself. Then a new sound cut through the ringing in her ears. It wasn't the distant thump of artillery or the rhythmic popping of rifles. It was a distinctly localized, metallic sound. Clang. Someone had just kicked the bottom rung of the tower's steel staircase. Vibrations travel differently through steel. They don't just make noise, they announce themselves through the soles of your boots. Rachel felt the heavy, hurried footsteps echoing up the zigzagging metal stairs long before she saw the shadows creeping up the grating. Clang, clang, clang. They weren't shooting at the tower anymore. They were coming up to clear it. Rachel dropped the Mark 13. In the tight, 3x3-foot space of the tower cab, a bolt-action sniper rifle was worse than useless. It was a liability. She unholstered her sidearm, a battered Glock 19, her thumb automatically checking the slide to ensure a round was chambered. She had 2 full magazines, 30 rounds of 9mm against whoever was coming up the chute. The tower cab was accessed by a heavy steel trapdoor set into the floor grates. It was currently propped open, a rectangular black void leading down to the exposed zigzag stairs. Rachel dropped to her stomach, low crawling towards the open hatch. The grated floor dug into her elbows and knees. She positioned herself at the edge, peering down through the heavy steel mesh that made up the floor of the catwalk just beneath her. Dust filtered up through the shafts of sunlight. 3 stories down, she saw movement. It was a team of 4 men. They were moving tactically, not like the disorganized mob in the courtyard. They wore black plate carriers over dirty civilian clothes, their rifles tucked tightly into their shoulders, muzzles pointed skyward. They were sweeping the corners of the switchback stairs. Rachel's heart hammered against her ribs, a violent, trapped bird. Her mouth was entirely devoid of saliva. This wasn't the clinical, detached geometry of sniping. This was raw, breath-smelling proximity. She leveled the Glock through the open trapdoor, aiming down the narrow vertical shaft. The lead fighter reached the landing of the third floor. He looked up, his eyes locking onto the dark square of the open hatch. He saw her. Before he could raise his weapon, Rachel fired. The Glock snapped sharply in her hand. 3 rapid shots. The confined space of the tower amplified the muzzle reports into a deafening physical pressure. The lead fighter took 2 rounds in the chest and 1 in the throat. He pitched backward, a spray of crimson painting the rusted metal wall behind him, and tumbled heavily down the steep stairs, crashing into the men behind him. "Contact up!" one of them screamed in accented English. Blind, panicked fire erupted from the stairs. Bullets chewed through the floor grates right beside Rachel's face. The metal splintered, sending sharp shards of shrapnel into her forearms. She flinched, rolling away from the opening and pressing her back against the solid steel wall of the tower cab. Hot brass from their rifles rained upward through the grates, pinging against the ceiling and falling around her like malevolent hail. Rachel gritted her teeth, ignoring the stinging cuts on her arms. She pulled a fragmentation grenade from her chest rig. Her fingers, slick with blood and sweat, fumbled with the safety pin. She yanked it hard, the metal ring biting into her knuckle. She held the spoon tight. "Fire in the hole," she muttered to no one. She leaned over, lobbed the small, heavy green sphere straight down through the trapdoor, and immediately scrambled backward, covering her ears and pressing her face into the deck. 1, 2, 3. The explosion was a contained, upward-directing pressure wave. The sound was a dull, heavy thud that shook the entire structure, threatening to rip the rusted bolts from the concrete foundations. A thick cloud of grey smoke and pulverized metal surged up through the trapdoor, choking the small cabin. Screams, wet and gurgling, drifted up from the second landing. Rachel didn't wait for the smoke to clear. She crawled back to the edge, coughing violently, her eyes tearing up from the explosive residue. She peered down into the grey haze. The stairs were a twisted ruin of bent metal and torn bodies. 2 men were dead, tangled together on the landing. A third man was crawling on his hands and knees, dragging a shattered leg, desperately trying to get back down to the ground floor. Rachel aimed the Glock. Her hands were shaking violently now, the adrenaline dump causing her muscles to misfire and twitch. She steadied her grip, holding her breath, and squeezed the trigger. A single shot. The crawling man collapsed, lying still on the blood-slicked grating. Silence descended on the stairwell, save for the rhythmic dripping of blood hitting the sand 3 stories below. Rachel slumped back against the wall, her chest heaving. The Glock felt incredibly heavy in her hand. She looked over at Cobb. He hadn't moved. The dust from the grenade had settled over his pale face, making him look like a forgotten statue. She wiped her stinging eyes with the back of her wrist, smearing a mixture of sweat, carbon, and blood across her forehead. She had held the stairs, for now. But the victory felt hollow, empty. The smell of the exploded grenade was cloying and metallic, sticking to the back of her throat. She looked out the jagged hole in the wall. The sun was beginning to dip lower toward the western ridge, casting long, bruised purple shadows across the valley. The courtyard was still a war zone, but the gunfire had grown sporadic, less organized. The enemy was regrouping. They had realized that taking the tower by force was costing them too much blood. A sharp, terrifying realization settled into Rachel's gut. If they couldn't shoot her out, and they couldn't rush the stairs, there was only one tactical option left for them. They were going to burn her out. Through the cracked optics of her abandoned Mark 13, she could see a group of fighters dragging jerry cans of diesel fuel toward the concrete base of the tower. They were splashing the dark, pungent liquid over the wooden support beams of the lower scaffolding and the stacked sandbags. Rachel scrambled to her knees, grabbing the sniper rifle. She jammed it through the hole, ignoring the blistering heat of the barrel against her bare skin. She found the men with the fuel cans in her scope, empty. She had never reloaded after dropping the DSHK gunner. She clawed at her chest rig, her fingers finding one of the 3 remaining magazines. She shoved it into the well, racked the bolt, and took aim. But a man down below was already holding a flare. The bright red chemical light hissed and spit sparks into the gathering twilight. He looked up at the tower, right at the shattered window where Rachel's barrel protruded. He didn't throw the flare, he just dropped it into the puddle of diesel at his feet. The fire caught instantly, a whoosh of ignition that sent a massive plume of thick, oily black smoke directly up the central column of the watchtower. The flames licked at the lower metal grates, the heat rising rapidly, turning the enclosed cabin into an oven. Rachel coughed as the black smoke poured through the open trapdoor. It was blinding, suffocating. She couldn't see the courtyard anymore. She couldn't see the men below. She could only see the thick, roiling grey and black clouds filling her small metal box. "Cobb," she choked out, her lungs burning as she grabbed his vest and tried to pull him upright. "Cobb, we have to move, now." He was dead weight. The fire cracked and roared beneath them, eating the structural supports, the heat intense enough to melt the rubber soles of her boots. The math was final. The tower was lost. The trapdoor was no longer an exit. It was a flue. Black, oily smoke surged up through the grated floor in thick, choking columns, driven by the intense draft of the burning diesel below. It smelled of sulfur, roasting rubber, and the sharp, chemical tang of melting insulation. Rachel dropped to her knees, hacking violently. The air down near the floorboards was marginally cooler, but the oxygen was rapidly vanishing. She slammed the heavy steel trapdoor shut and threw the rusted latch. It wouldn't stop the fire, but it momentarily choked off the direct column of smoke. The metal of the door was already warm to the touch. "Cobb," she gasped, crawling toward his slumped form. She grabbed the drag handle on the back of his plate carrier and hauled him upright. He flopped against her shoulder, a sack of wet grain. A smear of his blood transferred to her neck, hot and sticky. He groaned, a low, wet sound that vibrated against her collarbone, but his eyes remained shut. The temperature in the small cabin spiked. Rachel felt the sweat on her forehead instantly evaporate, replaced by a dry, stretching sensation across her skin. The hair on her forearms began to singe, curling into tiny, foul-smelling white ash. She couldn't take him down the stairs. The lower scaffolding was a roaring inferno, the wooden support beams cracking and popping like mortar fire. She looked at the jagged hole the ZU-23 had blown in the wall. Through the thick haze, she could see the top of a HESCO bastion, a massive wire basket filled with sand, about 30 feet below, situated just outside the immediate radius of the flames. In the corner of the tower cab, hanging from a thick iron hook, was an emergency egress line. 50 feet of heavy, braided nylon rope attached to a locking carabiner. Rachel dropped Cobb back to the floor, her lungs burning as she stood up into the thicker smoke. She unhooked the rope. Her hands were shaking so badly she dropped the coil twice. The metal hook clattered against the grating. She swore, a raw, ragged sound, and grabbed it again. She secured the carabiner to the thickest steel strut, remaining on the ceiling, locking the gate with a twist of her bloody thumb. She dragged the tail end of the rope over to Cobb. There was no time for a Swiss seat or a proper harness. She threaded the thick nylon directly through the reinforced drag handle on the back of his vest, tying a hurried, ugly bowline knot. She pulled it tight, praying the stitching on his carrier would hold. The floorboards beneath her boots began to warp. The soles of her boots felt soft, squishy. The heat was baking through the rubber. "All right, buddy, going for a ride," she rasped, coughing up a mouthful of dark phlegm. She dragged Cobb to the jagged tear in the wall. The metal edges were blistering hot. She shoved her Mark 13 sniper rifle out first, letting it fall. It hit the sandbags below with a dull thud. Then she grabbed Cobb by the shoulders and shoved him out the hole. His dead weight yanked the rope taut. The nylon cord zipped through her gloved hands. She clamped down, the friction instantly generating enough heat to burn through the leather palms of her gloves and blister the skin underneath. She gritted her teeth, a high, thin whine escaping her throat as she desperately slowed his descent. Down below, the fire illuminated the courtyard in erratic, hellish flashes of orange and red. Insurgents were still swarming the wreckage of the main gate, but a few had stopped to watch the tower burn. They saw the body drop from the window. Rifle fire began to snap and crack around the tower again. Bullets sparked against the steel, ricocheting wildly. Rachel didn't look down. She just focused on the rope, feeding it out foot by agonizing foot, her biceps screaming from the strain of holding a 200-pound man in suspension. The rope went slack. He was down. Rachel didn't hesitate. She grabbed the line, wrapped it once around her right boot to create a crude friction break, and threw herself out the jagged window. The heat outside the tower was worse. The flames from the base of the structure were reaching 20 feet into the air, a roaring wall of combustion that sucked the oxygen from the surrounding atmosphere. Rachel slid down the rope, the rough nylon biting into the burns on her palms. A bullet snapped past her ear, close enough to leave a sudden, sharp vacuum of air in its wake. She released her foot brake and let herself drop the last 10 feet. She hit the top of the Hesco bastion hard, her knees taking the brunt of the impact. The canvas top of the barrier gave way, dumping her awkwardly into the loose sand. She rolled, gasping for air, inhaling a lungful of cold, dusty desert wind. It was the sweetest thing she had ever tasted. She scrambled over the edge of the barrier, dropping into the narrow, dark trench between the sandbags and the outer wall of the ruined mess hall. Cobb was lying in the dirt a few feet away, his legs tangled in the nylon rope. Rachel crawled to him, her breathing ragged, heavy and loud. The roar of the burning tower behind them provided a thick blanket of white noise, but the sharp cracks of AK-47s were getting closer. She grabbed his shoulder and rolled him over. "Cobb!" she hissed. His head lolled to the side. The pale ash that had coated his face in the tower was now streaked with dark, wet mud, a mixture of sweat and the blood seeping from his nose. Rachel pressed 2 fingers hard into the hollow of his throat, right beneath his jawline. Her own pulse was hammering so violently in her fingertips that it took her 5 seconds to realize she wasn't feeling anything from him. She moved her fingers, pressing deeper. She held her breath. Nothing. No flutter. No beat. She stared at him in the flickering orange light of the burning tower. The cynical, quiet kid from Idaho who complained about the coffee and chewed his nails down to the quick. He was gone. He had probably bled out halfway down the rope. Rachel didn't cry. There was no sudden welling of emotion, no dramatic scream to the heavens. There was only a cold, heavy stone settling at the bottom of her stomach. The contradiction of war was stark. She had burned her hands to the bone to save a corpse. She reached down, unclipped the heavy ammunition pouches from his chest rig, and shoved them into her own dump pouch. She grabbed his remaining canteen. Then she unlaced his dog tags, the cool metal slipping through her burned fingers, and shoved them deep into her thigh pocket. She left him in the dirt. Ground level was a vastly different war. Up in the tower, the battle had been a sterile exercise in geometry and ballistics. Down here in the dirt, it was a chaotic, suffocating mess of raw noise, confusing shadows, and the overwhelming stench of raw sewage and copper blood. Rachel picked up her Mark 13 from the sand. The scope was thoroughly smashed now, the glass pulverized by the fall. She unscrewed the mounting rings with quick, jerky twists of her wrists and tossed the ruined optic into the darkness. The rifle was now just a heavy, awkward bolt-action club with iron sights. She pressed her back against the concrete foundation of the mess hall. The corrugated tin roof above her was riddled with shrapnel holes, whistling faintly as the hot desert wind blew across them. "Actual, this is 4. I am on the deck," she whispered into her radio, out of sheer habit. Dead air. The jammer was still active. She was entirely cut off. She peeked around the corner of the concrete wall. The courtyard was a graveyard of twisted metal and bodies. The insurgents were moving methodically now, sweeping through the hooches and the motor pool. They were executing the wounded. Rachel watched as 2 men in dark tunics walked up to a slumped Marine by a destroyed Humvee. One of them raised a rifle and fired a single shot into the back of the Marine's head. Rachel's jaw locked. The muscles in her neck stood out like steel cables. She raised the Mark 13, settling the iron sights squarely on the shooter's chest. She didn't have the luxury of magnification anymore. It was just a black post against a dark shirt, illuminated by the erratic glow of the burning Watchtower. She squeezed the trigger. The heavy .300 Win Mag round cracked through the air. At 100 yards, the impact was devastating. The shooter was violently thrown backward, his chest cavity caved in. The second man yelled, spinning around and spraying his AK wildly into the shadows. Rachel racked the bolt, the familiar, smooth clack-clack grounding her amidst the panic. She acquired the second man's muzzle flash, dropped the iron sight just below it, and fired. The man folded over his rifle, dropping to the dirt without a sound. Click. She was out of ammo in the gun. She reached into her dump pouch, her burned, blistered fingers fumbling blindly among Cobb's magazines. She found one, pulled the empty mag from her rifle, and jammed the fresh one home. Footsteps crunched in the gravel directly behind her. She spun, dropping the heavy rifle and drawing her Glock in a single, fluid motion. An insurgent was rounding the rear corner of the mess hall, his rifle lowered, a flashlight taped to the barrel sweeping the ground. He stepped right into Rachel's path. For a fraction of a second, they just stared at each other. He was young, maybe 19, with a thin, patchy beard and eyes wide with terror and adrenaline. He smelled strongly of unwashed clothes and sweet, stale tobacco. He tried to raise his rifle. Rachel didn't aim. She simply pointed the Glock from her hip and pulled the trigger twice. The sharp pop-pop of the 9mm was deafening in the tight alleyway. Both rounds struck the boy in the stomach. He dropped his rifle, his hands flying to his gut as he stumbled backward, a wet, gasping sound escaping his lips. He fell back against the Hesco barrier and slid down to the dirt. Rachel stood over him, her chest heaving, the Glock leveled at his head. He was looking up at her, his hands covered in his own blood, his mouth opening and closing like a landed fish. There was no heroics here, no honor, just a tired, burned woman standing over a dying teenager in a trench of sewage and sand. She lowered the pistol. He was gut-shot. He wasn't going to get up, and she needed the ammunition. She kicked his dropped rifle away, just to be sure. She had to keep moving. Staying static meant dying. Captain Miller had said they were falling back to the secondary bunker, a reinforced subterranean command center on the south side of the FOB. It was a 300-yard sprint across open ground, heavily populated by hostiles. She holstered the Glock and picked up the Mark 13. It felt like it weighed 50 pounds. Her arms were shaking, the lactic acid buildup from the rope descent finally catching up to her muscles. Her boots felt heavy, filled with sand and sweat. She peeked back around the corner of the mess hall. The courtyard was relatively clear for a brief moment, the main bulk of the enemy force distracted by the systematic looting of the motor pool. She took a deep breath, tasting the ash on her tongue. 300 yards, she muttered to herself. She broke from cover. She didn't sprint upright. She stayed low, a hunched, scrambling run, moving from shadow to shadow, using the wrecked vehicles and shattered concrete barriers as cover. Her breathing was a ragged engine in her ears. 50 yards. A spotlight from a technical swept across the courtyard, the beam cutting through the dust. Rachel threw herself flat onto her stomach, burying her face in the dirt behind the burned-out chassis of a supply truck. The light washed over the truck, illuminating the rusted metal inches from her nose. She held her breath until the beam passed. 100 yards. She pushed up, scrambling forward again. Her burned palms screamed in protest as they scraped against the gravel. She ducked behind a row of porta-johns, the stench of ruptured chemical toilets so overpowering it made her eyes water. Voices. Close. She pressed her back against the green plastic of the toilet, holding the Mark 13 tight against her chest. 2 fighters walked past on the other side, speaking rapidly in a guttural dialect, their boots crunching on the gravel not 3 feet from her. She could hear the clatter of their rifle slings. She closed her eyes, willing her heart to stop pounding so loudly against her ribs. They walked past. 200 yards. The entrance to the secondary bunker was visible now. It was a heavy steel door set into a concrete reinforced mound, flanked by a network of sandbagged trenches. But it wasn't safe. A squad of 10 insurgents had surrounded the entrance. They had a heavy machine gun set up on a bipod, pointed directly at the steel door, and 2 men were preparing breaching charges, taping blocks of C4 to the hinges. Rachel knelt behind a shattered concrete barrier, wiping the sweat from her eyes with her forearm. She had 15 rounds left for the Mark 13, 2 magazines for the Glock, and 1 fragmentation grenade on her chest rig. She looked at the 10 men. She looked at the heavy steel door. If they blew those hinges, the command staff inside, Miller, the intel officers, the wounded they had dragged in, would be slaughtered in a confined space. She rested the heavy barrel of the Mark 13 on the lip of the concrete barrier. She didn't have a spotter. She didn't have an optic. She just had the iron sights, a burned hand, and the cold, terrifying certainty that she was the only thing standing between those men and a massacre. She exhaled slowly, settling the front post on the chest of the man holding the detonator. Pressure met resistance. The trigger of the Mark 13 broke with a crisp, heavy snap. The .300 Winchester Magnum round tore through the 30 yards of superheated air between Rachel's concrete barrier and the bunker entrance. It struck the insurgent holding the C4 detonator squarely in the center of his chest plate. The kinetic energy didn't just kill him, it lifted him off his boots and slammed him backward into the heavy steel door of the bunker with a sickening metallic clang. The plastic detonator box clattered harmlessly into the dust. Chaos erupted instantly. The remaining 9 men scrambled, shouting in panicked, overlapping voices, raising their rifles toward the darkness. Rachel didn't pause to admire the hit. Her blistered palms slapped the bolt handle up and back. The spent brass casing spun out, hot and smoking, bouncing off her knee. She slammed the bolt forward, stripping a fresh round from the magazine, her eyes never leaving the iron sights. She shifted the black front post to the machine gunner lying prone behind the bipod. Crack! The gunner's head snapped violently to the side, his helmet flying off into the trench. He slumped over the feed tray of the weapon. "Contact! Trench line!" one of the fighters screamed, pointing directly at the concrete barrier hiding Rachel. Green tracers suddenly zipped over Rachel's head, close enough that the supersonic crack of the passing rounds hurt her eardrums. Concrete dust exploded from the top of the barrier, showering her face in sharp, blinding grit. She ducked low, pressing her cheek against the filthy gravel, her heart hammering a frantic, erratic rhythm against her ribs. They had her zeroed. Suppressive fire chewed away at the edges of her cover. She had 13 rounds left in the rifle, but sticking her head up over that barrier meant taking a bullet to the face. The geometry had shifted against her. She was pinned, and they still had the C4 strapped to the door hinges. Rachel let go of the heavy sniper rifle. It was useless to her now. She drew the Glock 19 with her right hand, the polymer grip slippery with her own blood. With her left hand, she unclipped the single fragmentation grenade remaining on her chest. Rig. Her fingers were shaking so violently she could barely hook her index finger through the metal pull ring. She squeezed her eyes shut, inhaling the stench of ruptured sewage and vaporized concrete, and yanked the pin. She held the spoon down. She couldn't throw it over the top. They were firing too low. She dropped to her stomach, low-crawled to the right edge of the shattered concrete barrier, and blindly lobbed the grenade around the corner, side-arming it toward the bunker entrance. She pulled her knees to her chest and covered the back of her neck. The explosion was a deafening, concussive slap that vibrated through the ground and knocked the breath out of her lungs. A shower of dirt, jagged metal fragments, and shredded sandbags rained down around her. The suppressive fire abruptly stopped, replaced by a chorus of wet, agonizing screams. Rachel didn't wait for the dust to settle. She pushed herself up, her thigh muscles burning with lactic acid, and rounded the corner of the barrier. The trench leading to the bunker door was a slaughterhouse. The grenade had detonated in the confined space between the sandbag walls, shredding the men closest to the blast. 4 were down, motionless or convulsing in the dirt. 3 were staggering, blinded and deafened, their hands clutching bleeding faces and ruptured eardrums. Rachel moved forward, the Glock raised. There was no hesitation, no moral wrestling. It was a mechanical clearing process. Pop. Pop. The first staggering man dropped. 2 9mm holes punched through his throat. Pop. Pop. The second man fell backward, his knee buckling as a round shattered his pelvis, followed by another to his chest. She stepped over a severed arm, her boot slipping slightly in a pool of dark, frothy arterial blood. The smell of copper was overpowering, thick and nauseating in the back of her throat. The third wounded man raised his AK blindly, firing a wild, erratic burst into the sky. Rachel stepped into his peripheral vision and fired her last 3 rounds directly into his center mass. The slide of the Glock locked back with a dry, hollow click. Empty. She dropped the empty magazine, slapped her final fresh one into the well, and hit the slide release. 2 men were left. They had been shielded from the grenade blast by the heavy machine gun mount. They saw her coming and rushed her, abandoning their rifles in the tight confines of the trench, drawing long, curved combat knives. Rachel fired wildly, her stance compromised by the loose, blood-slicked gravel. She hit the first man in the shoulder, spinning him around, but the second man closed the distance, lunging at her. He collided with her, the sheer physical weight of his body driving her backward. She slammed hard against the sandbag wall, the breath rushing from her lungs in a pained gasp. The man was screaming in her face, his breath foul with rotting teeth and chewing tobacco. He drove the knife down toward her collarbone. Rachel brought her left arm up, blocking the downward thrust. The blade sliced through her combat shirt and bit deep into the meat of her forearm. White-hot pain flared up to her shoulder. She didn't scream. She gritted her teeth, shoving the muzzle of the Glock hard into the man's stomach under his plate carrier. She pulled the trigger until the gun went click. The man's eyes went wide. The strength vanished from his grip. He sagged against her, hot blood pouring from his abdomen, soaking through Rachel's pants. She shoved his dead weight off her. He collapsed into the mud. The man she had shot in the shoulder was trying to crawl away, dragging himself toward the heavy steel door of the bunker. Rachel stood over him, panting, bleeding from the gash in her arm, her entire body trembling with the toxic mixture of shock and adrenaline. She aimed the empty pistol at him, her brain unable to process that she had fired her last round. The man reached the door and weakly pounded a bloody fist against the steel. Rachel stepped forward to kick him back, but the heavy mechanical clank of deadbolts sliding open stopped her. The massive steel door of the bunker shrieked as it swung inward, heavy hinges protesting the movement. A blinding beam from a tactical flashlight cut through the smoke and dust of the trench, hitting Rachel directly in the eyes. She squinted, bringing her bloody left hand up to shield her face, the Glock still dangling loosely in her right. "Friendly! Don't shoot! Friendly!" A harsh, frantic voice barked from the darkness of the doorway. "Jesus Christ," another voice muttered. Two sets of hands grabbed Rachel by the webbing of her chest rig. They didn't ask if she was okay, they simply yanked her violently over the threshold. She stumbled, her boots catching on the thick steel lip of the doorframe, and collapsed onto the smooth, cool concrete floor of the bunker. Behind her, the heavy door slammed shut. The deadbolt slammed into place with final, echoing thuds. The silence inside the bunker was absolute, broken only by the ragged, desperate sounds of Rachel's own breathing. The air was cool, smelling heavily of stale sweat, ozone from the radio equipment, and iodine. It was a sensory shock. "Doc, get over here. We got a bleeder." A man knelt beside her. It was Captain Miller. His uniform was torn, his face smeared with grease, and his eyes were wide with a manic, terrified energy. He pointed a flashlight at her, sweeping the beam over her ruined uniform. "Cole," Miller breathed, disbelief coating his voice. "Rachel, is that you?" Rachel tried to speak, but her throat was completely dry. Her tongue felt like swollen sandpaper. She simply nodded, a jerky, exhausted movement of her chin. "Where's Cobb?" Miller demanded, looking back toward the sealed door as if expecting the young spotter to phase through the steel. "Where is he?" Rachel closed her eyes. The image of Cobb's pale, dirty face, staring up at the desert sky, flashed behind her eyelids. The phantom weight of his body on the burning rope still burned the muscles in her back. "Dead," she croaked. Her voice sounded like grinding stones. "Left him. Outside." Miller's jaw tightened. He didn't offer condolences. There was no time for grief. He just looked at her arm, where the dark blood was steadily dripping off her fingertips and pooling on the pristine concrete floor. A medic slid in next to Miller, tearing open a pressure dressing with his teeth. He grabbed Rachel's arm roughly. She hissed as he packed the deep knife wound with gauze, wrapping it tightly with an elastic bandage. "You look like hell, Chief," the medic muttered, pulling her combat glove off to inspect the severe friction burns on her palms. The skin was peeled back, raw and weeping. "Thanks, Hayes," she whispered. Rachel pushed herself up until her back rested against the cold, damp concrete wall. She looked around the bunker. It was packed. 30 Marines and support personnel were crammed into the dimly lit subterranean room. Some were bleeding, leaning on each other. Others were staring blankly at the walls, their eyes hollow, the 1,000-yard stare settling in early. The radio operators in the corner were desperately working the dials. Bathed in the green glow of the monitors, still fighting the jamming signals, they were trapped. 500 fighters were above them, currently burning the base to the ground. The bunker was reinforced, designed to withstand direct artillery strikes, but it was just a concrete tomb if nobody came to dig them out. Miller crouched down in front of her, resting his elbows on his knees. The blast doors will hold for a few hours. They don't have the heavy ordnance to crack the roof. But they're going to try and smoke us out through the ventilation shaft soon. Rachel looked down at her hands. They were shaking uncontrollably now. The adrenaline was finally abandoning her system, leaving behind a cold, hollow void filled with exhaustion and pain. Every muscle fiber in her body screamed in protest. Her cheek throbbed where the shrapnel had cut her. Her forearms burned. Her leg ached. "We need to hold until QRF from Bagram gets here," Miller continued, his voice strained. "Air support is inbound. We just have to stay alive until sunrise." Rachel didn't answer. She reached into the thigh pocket of her cargo pants. Her bloody, trembling fingers closed around the cold metal of Cobb's dog tags. She pulled them out, the small chain clinking softly in the quiet bunker. She stared at the stamped letters. The cynical kid from Idaho. She wasn't a superhero. She hadn't saved the day. She had just bought them a few hours of suffocating darkness, paid for in blood, burned skin, and the lives of the men she couldn't pull back from the edge. "Sunrise," Rachel repeated, her voice flat, hollow. She closed her fist around the dog tags, the metal biting into her raw palm. She leaned her head back against the concrete, closing her eyes as the dull, rhythmic thudding of explosives began again on the surface, directly above their heads. The math hadn't changed. They were still trapped, and the night was far from over. The siege of FOB Oulette pushed one sniper to the absolute edge of human endurance, transforming a sterile overwatch position into a visceral, blood-soaked fight for survival in the mud. Rachel Cole's story isn't about glorious victory. It's about the raw, grueling reality of what it takes to survive when the numbers are entirely against you. If you appreciate gritty, grounded military storytelling that honors the brutal reality of combat without the Hollywood clichés, hit that like button right now. Share this video with your friends and make sure to subscribe to the channel so you never miss our deep dives into the chaotic, unforgiving world of modern warfare. Let us know in the comments what you would have done in Tower 4.